Hello, welcome to Evolution. I'm Jawless. This is GCSE Biology. So I'm just going to hit maximum screen. So this is Evolution for GCSE Biology. It's for all exam boards, so OCR, EdXL, OCR, EdXL, AQA, and so on. Okay, any of the exam boards can ask you about evolution and natural selection. So let's start off. Some learning aims. Number 1, an overview of the history of life on Earth. Number 2, an overview of how animals change over time through natural selection, and a discussion of the fossil evidence for evolution. Okay, so let's go to our first slide. Got a lot of time to cover. It's just the beginning of the Earth. So the Earth formed approximately 4.5 billion years ago. It was very hot and it was very molten. Okay, so first formed by all the rocks coalescing together in the early solar system to form basically a huge ball of molten lava, really. So no living organisms that we know of today could survive that heat. So there was no life on Earth at this point, also no atmosphere, to breathe or to process. So that's 4.5 billion years for the formation. So the first 4.5 billion to 3.5 billion is sometimes known as the boring billion, sometimes in biology. So it seemed like nothing much really happened. Okay, so there was no evidence of anything really happening. Of course, it must have been started developing, but we didn't have any evidence of it. It's still a bit of a mystery. But 3.5 billion years ago, we have some evidence. Fossils of single-celled organisms. So single-celled organisms, the type you see under a microscope, don't make very good fossils. It's because the type of animal organism that makes good fossils has a skeleton, a shell, or an exoskeleton. So like crab make very good fossil. Okay, humans we'd fossilise very well, but something sort of squishy and small wouldn't fossilise very well. So by 3.4 billion years ago, rock formation, so a bit more evidence, okay, that there was single-celled organisms because they had rock formations very similar to these things called stromatolites today in Australia. And we know these things are made of microbes, so little bacteria, making little colonies and feeding off sort of the nutrients in the mud. Okay, so we know these around today, and they had fossils of very similar structures 3.4 billion years ago. So we think that they're very similar to what we see today. So by 3 billion years, there's some evidence that there are viruses around. So viruses need other living things to survive. They are parasites. They can't live on their own. They need to have other cells to live in. They would need what's called a host. So life must have developed and the viruses came about. So yeah, there's possibly as old as life itself. But again, we don't have all the evidence. It's quite an ongoing sort of forefront of research. Is the beginning of life. There's big gaps in it. Okay, we'll talk about soon, and there's lots of mysteries still involved. And there could be news up tomorrow. Someone discovered something new, and maybe some even older things are discovered. But this is what we know at the moment, currently today. Okay, so another billion years goes past. You look at there, 3 billion, 2 billion. So really big passages of time go past the beginning of life. So the eukaryotic cells are forming. So cells with nucleus. So we're getting to a little bit our very, very ancient ancestors. So cells with nuclei formed 2 million years ago. There were little fossils that were observed 800 million years ago. The first evidence of multi-celled life emerges. Again, very faint fossils. Okay, but by 580 million, we're going to have some better fossils. The fossils getting better. Before this point, they're trying to trace fossils and keep that's stromatolites. Like, kind of, we don't have evidence. So by 580 million years, we have the first relative of the jellyfish, Nidarians, evolves. So this is suddenly where everything sort of makes a jump start. Okay, so 575 million years ago, the strange life forms known as the Ediacaran. Okay, so it's the Ediacaran period. It's also the life forms known as the Ediacarans appear. So these types of organisms, fossils appear all across the world in rocks of 575 million years approximately old. This looks like a plant, but it's not. It's a type of animal. Again, we don't know everything about them. Okay, so this is first appear. We don't even know these are part of that same animal or not. Also, animals with a backbone, so sort of traces of backbone started to appear. and then suddenly 535 million years ago, it's called the Cambrian Explosion begins. So it's like seemed like suddenly all these different types of animals started to appear. Okay, so this from the Burgess Shale. Okay, so this went from about 535 to 530. So again, look how small the time jump's becoming here. The time jumps are becoming smaller and smaller as we go along, where things sort of, suddenly explosion of life. Okay, so these are things from the Burgess Shale. So this is so some of these things are very faint. It's called hallucigenia because it's like nobody actually knows what this animal will look like. So these are trilobites. Okay, so we know a bit more about these things. Trilobites. This is what's been a type of crab. So is this. It's called Morella. That one. Some of these fossils are very famous. So they've actually got little names for the species. So they're so famous. So by this time, the first true vertebrate animal with a backbone. So this is actually called Picaya. So it's probably our very, very ancient relative we're looking at there. So it appears to evolve from also you have jawless fish evolving. So when you see a jawless fish, you probably think, how does it eat? It's a bit like an eel or a lamprey. Okay, so jawless fish is still around today. It's not like a trout or something like that. It's an eel or lamprey. So, and again, around the same time, trilobites developed. So all these different things all suddenly developed at the same time it appeared. Okay, so although we say it's Cambrian Explosion, there could have been life, complex life before, but it just could be that we just haven't found the earlier fossils yet. So again, every day this could change. Okay, but this is our current knowledge at the moment. Could be that the fossil was just too squishy, but then we had the, so this is news, this is very recent, the jellyfish fossil. So it could be we find even more. So we always thought there must be life before then, to suddenly appear, but we didn't have very much evidence. The trilobites are a very successful group of organisms, and they kind of dominated the oceans for another 200 million years. Okay, and then they died out. It's probably due to environmental change. We'll talk about a bit more later. Okay, so we're kind of coming from down here. This is sort of fossil posters you see on the wall quite a lot. So you have something, so it's split into different parts. Late Proterozoic. Proterozoic means before life. And you go into the Paleozoic. So this is the time millions of years, 650, 600. So we were going to here, weren't we? The Cambrian Explosion. Okay, so this is when we had actually kind of whole fossils, good fossils. But before then we had, so this is part of the Ediacaran. So this is some of the Ediacaran fossils. Okay. So Cambrian, we get like the first definite animals in the Cambrian, the first fish, first chordates, so the backbone. It's that little Picaya thing, so it's swimming along. The Ordovician, so by 500 to 450, we have diversification. This is called Metazoan family, so all different types of life. So you probably could tell life most likely developed in the oceans as well. Most likely it was oceanic. And then we get, it takes quite a long time for life to go onto land. It's the first vascular land plants we have. So that means plants that have stems, and so before this, possibly might have mosses. So mosses are non-vascular plants. The first vascular things like roses, trees. No trees quite yet, but it's very small ones. The Devonian, you have the armoured fish. I would advise you to look that. They're very interesting. The jawed fishes and the armoured fish in the Devonian. First amphibians. We haven't even got mammals yet, so still waiting for those. Then we have the Carboniferous. In America, it's split into the Pennsylvania Mississippian from the places where they fossils are found. In the UK, we generally call it the Carboniferous. First reptiles, so we're getting to our ancestors slowly, aren't we? Scale trees, we don't have those anymore. They're a bit like a cycad. They CYCAD, a cycad, if you look that. Seed ferns, we still have ferns still around. So actually, this is the time when the coal, so coal you burn the fire, actually started. So these plants actually formed the coal all this time ago, and it took all that time for it to form coal. Permian, so mass extinctions. There wasn't just an extinction at the end of the dinosaurs, there's also other extinctions. Okay, so the Permian was the biggest at the end of the Permian, so 250 million years ago was actually the most major extinction of life on Earth. The trilobites went, okay, at the end of that. So it's going from the bottom up. Then after that extinction, it kind of led way to even more other complex forms of life. First dinosaurs and the first mammals. Right? So we've got our it took a long time for the formation of the Earth, but we've got the first mammals. It took a long time. Okay. Jurassic dinosaurs diversify. Okay, so you're getting into this order of types, because first of all, they're actually quite small dinosaurs. They've got to be big. First flowering plants. So yeah, flowering plants are actually younger than dinosaurs. I was always amazed at that. Is that the first dinosaurs were around, there wasn't any daisies, wasn't any flowers around. Primates, again, our relatives. Dinosaurs. Okay, extinction of dinosaurs. That's probably the one everyone knows about. 65 million years ago, extinction of dinosaurs. Then we get into, so Mesozoic means middle life. Paleozoic means ancient life. So I'm just saying what these things. Cenozoic means recent life, which is kind of not very interesting. Mammals diversify. And look at humans, we only evolved in the last 2.6 million years, so really, really recent. Compared to all the other things. Jellyfish, they were around since back here. Jellyfish were around, so we're recent compared to them. Okay, so it's quite hard to understand that scale. So I have a 1 minute video that I found. Just see 1 minute, okay, to show that. It's really interesting actually. So I'm gonna let it play for 1 minute. Okay, so that was the whole of the history of life. We just talked about all in 1 minute. Okay, so it's giving you a scale about how there was a long time nothing happened, and then suddenly everything happened. Okay, and that's very. There's other ways of doing it. I actually like to write it out on obviously a big long piece of paper, and then like humans, like mammals, like the last little bit of the paper. Okay, so let's think about. It's obviously it's really interesting to think about the scale of that. Okay, so evolution of organisms. Okay, so you've looked at animals changing, but how does that work? Okay, so it means over time. So evolution, so animals change by natural selection. So it's important to understand. So a lot of the time it's environmental. Okay, so a lot of the time it was the weather, the climate change. But let's have a look closely. So over time, inherited characteristics are selected, which best suit the natural environment surrounding them. So weak, I put that in quotations because it's just weak compared to the environment, okay? Weak characteristics die and eventually removed from the population. This is known as survival of the fittest. So yeah, it depends on what environment there is. Let's look at this. There's quite a few cases of this. Okay, so example that so if you say a few hundred years ago, there was a population of lions living in savannah. So we've got desert grasslands. Some were darker coloured than others, and others were more similar coloured to their surroundings. Okay, so lions compete, they're quite fierce, so they compete against each other for food, so they'll want to compete for food source and shelter. Okay, so animals compete for food, they compete for shelter, so if it was birds we're talking about, they compete for trees to roost in. So the lions, so the lighter coloured lions that were blended in, okay, so they were more successful at catching the food because the prey couldn't see them, and they had a better chance of surviving because they caught more food. The darker coloured lions stood out against the background, and the prey would more likely to run off. So you could say 100 years later, it takes quite a while. The darker lions die off because it's harder for them to catch prey, and the lighter lions survive and pass the light coloured genes to their offspring. Okay, so the lighter lions are more likely to survive and pass their genes on. And the lighter colours is the adaptation. They are better suited to their environment, and more lighter lions breed and reproduce. So I guess it just depends on the environment. So if they lived somewhere where the soil was darker, the darker lions would have been successful. And we see that, actually seen that in today. So this is a very, very famous exam question about peppered moths. So these are the same species of moth, but some are light coloured and some are dark coloured. So it says peppered moths can either be speckled or black. So they're like white speckled or they're black. So some scientists captured 488 black moths and 496 speckled ones. They placed a small white paint dot on the underneath, so it's kind of stomach area, abdomen, of each one, and let them go in an unpolluted forest. A couple of months later, they recaptured the moths in the same area. Of the ones with dots on, they found 34 black ones and 62 speckled ones. Okay, so it's just a reason why not all moths with dots on were captured. This seems obvious, but either some were eaten, or if they didn't. So one reason that they could have been eaten by predators would have been a reason. So B, which type of moth seemed to survive better in the forest? So more speckled ones were found, so it's light ones. So speckled moths survive better in the forest. So why do you think this type of moth survived better in the forest? Because there are more trees it blended in with. Okay, so they're more possibly like a silver birch tree. So there are more trees that the moth blended in with, are camouflaged, so it did not get eaten by predators as much. Why was the paint put on the underside of the moth and not the top? Because if you put that on the top of the moth, it could have affected the experiment by making the moth more visible to predators. Okay, so this is used quite a lot. Okay, the story behind this, where these are two of the same species of moth, is that when cities become more populated and more polluted, unfortunately, the black moths survive better because the trees become blackened with soot. Okay, and then these ones now stand out on the trees, whereas the black ones blend in. So yeah, it depends on the environment, and that could lead to kind of an evolution of the species. Okay, variation. It's a very famous question about the speckled moths. Okay, so it's good to look back on those. And when the environment changes, it can really change what was called characteristics are favoured. So also, you can have the evolution of a new species. Okay, so even something goes so far, the environment changes. Species can be actually two different species can be produced from one species. So a large population with common gene pool. So if you look at all the same species, those little creatures. Isolation is one, so there's different reasons for it. So two populations can be separated by a barrier, so mountains or the ocean. Okay, mutations can develop. So suddenly things like this one can have bigger ears, or it's a bit hairier, or a different colour can suddenly develop. So a mutation. So that's like a sudden change. It can change the colour of something, or something could just pop up with a different colour. And sometimes it's advantageous to the animal. Okay, so example we said like with the lion, sometimes like a lighter coloured lion could just pop up, and that has a benefit. Not always though, because sometimes the mutation causes a negative effect that can affect their actual survival. And then natural selection can occur. Okay, so example is temperature falls, and the hairier animal who's got a bigger, thicker coat, okay, has an advantage, so more survive, and they're going to pass their genes on, whereas less hairy don't survive. Okay, or predation. So example, the blue ones, example in this environment could blend in better, and the green ones are picked off, and after a long period of time, that they become so different, they become a different species. Okay, this happens quite a lot in animals that are on islands, because that happened in some birds called finches, like small birds. They all started with the same species, they got separated by large bodies of water over time, and too far they couldn't fly across, and they actually became suited to their own environments. They're called Darwin's finches, if you look them up, and that each type of bird actually has a different beak adaptation to actually help it to eat the different nuts on the island. Okay, so this is, you can actually see in the fossils the evolution of the horse. Okay, so horses, that's today's horse, they actually evolved from a tiny horse millions of years ago called Eohippus. Okay, so they actually used to live in more of a swampy area, as the more western climate, so they had bigger area of feet they could run around on, but the environment became drier and more like a grassland. Okay, like and so over time, animals with more hoofs and more sort of sturdy hoof-like design were favoured. So over time, this led to the evolution, so selection, okay, of the animals with more sort of a bigger bit in the middle, the hoof bit in the middle, so they could run around and run away from predators. Okay, so yeah, evolution is quite a complex topic to talk about. It's very interesting. So let's go over the aims here. So go back. So it's an overview of the history of life on Earth. So yeah, lots of time to go over, watch that video again. We just need to the main points that I put down. An overview of how animals change over time through natural selection. So the moth or the lion, so or animal can become hairy because it's cold. Lots and lots of different things you have to apply your knowledge to a new situation. As long as you have a theory like that behind it, you don't need to know about individual animals too much. And discussion of fossil evidence for evolution. So fossils were changing over time. You can see development of different fossil forms over time. Okay, and the evidence that we found fossils of the horse. So we can actually see the different body parts evolving over time. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed that class. Hope to see you in a different one. And goodbye. Thank you for joining.